Govanen, and welcome to the Palantir podcast, the broadcasting arm of GHG Palantir, a completely online Tolkien discussion group, and a branch of the Grey Havens group. Find out more about us on Facebook or greyhavensgroup.org. We continue our discussion of the Silmarillion with Chapter 9 of the Flight of the Noldor. One of the interesting things that came out first in our meeting today was the concept that this is a place where people often stop reading the Silmarillion. In part because this is one of the longest chapters that we have yet come to, as well as one of the densest and perhaps one of the most confusing, but also because from here on out, everything is pretty much downhill. For the remainder of the First Age, with the exception of a few bright, shining points in the history of the elves, it is going to be a period of unnumbered tears, of great sadness, of great tragedy, and huge and traumatic ruin. This chapter deals with the aftermath of the previous, the darkening of Valinor, where everyone has been left in a sense of shock over the death of the two trees. Everyone has gathered around Azelohar, the green mound where the two trees reside, questioning what to do. And Yavanna comments that there is some work that may be accomplished only once, and once only. But that perhaps she could revive the trees using the Silmarils which contain their light. And so the Valar questioned Feanor, who is there from the festival, as to whether or not he will yield up to them the Silmarils to be used to revive the two trees. And this puts him in a dilemma. Only Aule seems to understand and respond, "Be not hasty. We ask a greater thing than thou knowest. Let him have peace yet a while." Feanor responds by speaking bitterly. "For the less, even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish but once only, and in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. And if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain, first among all the Eldar in Aman." After thinking for a while, and indeed thinking along the lines of thought that Melkor has planted, Feanor refuses. During this time, we learn from a messenger who comes to the Valar that Melkor has been to Formenos with Ungoliant and stolen the Silmarils and murdered Feanor's father. Feanor descends into a rage and descends into grief and flees into the night. Morgoth escapes to the north with Ungoliant, where once they have passed into the northern space of Middle-earth, she turns to him, claiming that he has not fully repaid her for her services. If you recall in the previous chapter, he had promised to feed her with both hands, and that phrase is very important, of the wealth of light that they would capture from Valinor. And he does. He ends up feeding her of all the jewels and gems which had been stolen from Formenos, following after all the light which she had consumed in the killing of the two trees. And she grows very strong and very dark, very scary compared to Melkor. But he holds back the Silmarils for himself. So she turns on him. And at this point in the narrative, Melkor screams, and the Balrogs, which have remained in Angband, come to his rescue, and Ungoliant flees. And it's stated that she flees into the mountains and spawns a race of deadly spiders, and then disappears into the unknown. From here, we return to the events in Valinor, where Feanor has returned to Tirion-on-Tuna, claimed the kingship, and begins to speak out against the Valar, and that they should leave and claim their rightful place in Middle-earth, building off of the rumors and the speculation which Melkor had seeded among them in previous chapters. Also, to culminate this speech, he takes a terrible oath, swearing by Iluvatar, and by Taniquetil, and by Manwë and Varda, that he and his sons, who take the oath as well, will search to the ends of the earth and claim vengeance against anyone, Vala, demon, elf, or man, who claims the Silmarils or keeps them away from the possession of the House of Feanor. The Noldor begin to travel north, although many have misgivings. And Feanor attempts to persuade the Teleri to lend them ships. When they do not, this leads to the first kinslaying, as the Noldor board the ships and fight off and kill Teleri for the possession of their ships. Many of the Noldor are also slain in this battle. And this is one of the gravest sins of the Noldor. The ships which the Noldor have stolen, as well as the host which follows on shore, head north, where they are met by a messenger of Manwë, who we are told, although it isn't definite, is perhaps Mondos, who lays upon them the doom of Mondos, as it is understood, that Feanor and his kin, due to their oath, are exiled from Valinor, and that any who leave Valinor will be barred from return, and will not be heard in their laments, and will not be aided by the Valar if they continue on their path. Some of them are shaken by this, whereas some of them are not. Some of them continue without a thought, namely being the House of Feanor, who continue on. Whereas and I believe, and there are too many F names, and I'm sure this confuses you all. I will try to find it. I believe it's Finarfin, maybe, returns to claim the kingship in Tirion on Tuna. Let's see. Yes, Finarfin returned to Tirion on Tuna. However, his sons continue on. So essentially, the race of the Noldor has been completely torn apart into those who are fanatically following the path of Feanor, those who follow out of loyalty to the High Kingship as well as to the familial bonds, and those who repent of their deeds and return and are forgiven. The Noldor continue to the north, and as they continue to the north, the lands of Aman and the lands of Beleriand in Middle-earth come closer and closer together, such that Feanor and his sons and their host travel across the sea in the ships stolen from the Teleri and reach the other shore. And what does Feanor do? He burns those ships. And the rest of the Noldor are forced to cross the Helcaraxa, which is a band of shifting and grinding ice which links Valinor and the north of Beleriand. Now, obviously, an enormous amount occurs during this chapter, and it can be tremendously confusing, as you can tell by me struggling to remember who becomes king, who stays and who goes. And one of the tricks with the Silmarillion, in terms of breaking through these moments which can potentially bog you down in information, is to not get hung up on those names, to not get hung up on trying to remember specific points, but to read through the entire story. And when you have done this over and over again, begin to pick up more and more. It's very much like a true history, which indeed is. Tolkien describes it in the foreword to The Lord of the Rings as a feigned history. And with any kind of history, you're going to end up with multiple events taken from many different angles with multiple characters who play a part. And yes, you can try to remember them all, but just like me, you can look them up later. One of the nice things about the Silmarillion in particular is it's broken up into chapters, and each of those chapters can essentially function as their own little segment of story. Yes, tied one to the next, leading one into the other perhaps, but not in all cases. But you can take them as a singular element and begin to study and understand the events that are happening isolated within that one chapter. Now, the biggest piece, the biggest theme of this particular chapter is that beginning of the phase of unnumbered tears for the Noldor. It is their fall. It is their breakdown. It is their ruin. This is essentially a recreation, if we look at the Silmarillion as a form of elvish Bible narrative, or cast in that light, then this is essentially the story of Genesis and the expulsion from the garden. We are seeing drawn out through these series of events in this chapter and those which come before, their fall, their temptation, and their fall. Now, one of the interesting things in this chapter, too, is we get the most speech that we have and probably ever will get from Mandos, who is the doomsayer and also the lord over the afterlife of the land of Mandos, which of course is what he's named after. The first is in response to Feanor's statement that to break open the Silmarils in order to reinvigorate the two trees would destroy him, would lead to his own death. And Mandos says, in response to Feanor's statement that he would be the first of all the Eldar and Amon to be slain, not the first. What was intriguing about our discussion this morning is the fact that we had some disagreement as to who Mandos is referring to. On the one side, we have perhaps the character of Miriel, Feanor's mother, who has, among all the Eldar, at least that is reported in the Quenta, the first to have died in any sense of the word. If you remember, she gave up her spirit to Feanor, essentially, to make him that much more powerful and hot of a character, that all the flame and the passion of her existence went from her into him. And we've often joked in our meetings about how Feanor must have been an absolute terror as a toddler, and so who can blame Miriel for wanting to take essentially what boils down to an eternal nap? But all kidding aside, she does indeed go to Mandos. She does die. But the question is this who Mandos is actually referring to? Because Miriel dies, in a sense, in a sort of suicide. Either that or in a sort of just deep and utter exhaustion. So the question could be, does she fall into this category which Feanor has made of someone who's broken at heart and who is slain? Or is Mandos referring to the death of Finwë? Whether this is an event which just occurred, is occurring now in the moment, or will occur shortly. And what's interesting is Mandos keeps himself just to those words. Because as we will see later, and this is brought up by the narrator, this is a really important moment. It's a critical moment for the soul of Feanor and the soul of the Noldor, because Feanor will eventually be the instigator of their fall, beyond even what Melkor did before. And so what would have happened, the narrator asked, had Feanor accepted the will of the Valar, even though he couldn't have actually given the Silmarils to them, even though it would ultimately turn out to be pointless? What would have happened had he said, yes, I will yield the Silmarils to you? We don't know, but we can speculate, because we see with the words of presumably Mandos in the Doom, up in the north borders of Valinor, that now, because Feanor has set himself against them and blamed them for all that has happened, because he has set them up as the antagonist along with Melkor, they too set him up as antagonists. Perhaps, instead of lolling about around the two trees, the Valar all, along with the Noldor, would have followed Melkor. gone across and done battle now rather than at the end of the first stage. Perhaps the Teleri would have willingly given up their ships and even gone with the Noldor, with the understanding that instead of being a vendetta perhaps, or instead of being a rebellion, that this is a joint effort. Now, given the character of Feanor, given what we've seen of who he is and his attitude, it's still unlikely this would happen. But it is far more likely that the sorrows which are to come would be at least marginally lessened had he given in at this moment. Because the other thing we need to question here is how much of the angst, the anger, the drive we see in Feanor is due to the loss of the Silmarils and their apparent lust on the side of the Valar to have them to resurrect the trees, and how much of what comes after is simply an expression of his rage and his sorrow over the loss of his father. So you can also argue, would saying yes to the Valar have had any effect even then? Or would it have still continued along the path that we see, the path towards their destruction? We are told, earlier we've been told, that Feanor was extremely jealous of his half-brothers in their relationship with his father. This indeed was the reason for his expulsion from Tirion and his exile to Formenos. That's about as close as we come to understanding or even seeing any kind of love on the part of Feanor for his father. His father, of course, shows his love and selflessness by abandoning the kingship and going to Formenos with his son as a form of support for him. Even knowing and understanding and believing his son to be in the wrong, he does this anyways. We haven't seen anything like a true and simple representation of love from Feanor. And yet we are told, after learning of the death of his father, that first he cursed Melkor, naming him Morgoth, and then he cursed the summons of Manwë, who brought him away from home. And then he ran from the Ring of Doom and fled into the night. For his father was dearer to him than the light of Valinor or the peerless work of his hands. And who among sons of elves or of men have held their fathers of greater worth? So we are told that his father is that much more important even than the Silmarils themselves. And yet, to some degree, you can see the seeds of the rebellion here. You can understand the hurt that would lead to the hardening of Feanor's position. Because his father died to preserve the work of his hands, the Silmarils. And therefore, there's pretty much at this point no way Feanor would give them up, particularly because of the death of his father, but also because of his connection with the Silmarils, which we've discussed before. So one of the themes we end up here is with the concept of death, murder, suicide, and what that means, how they compare one to another, and also how that ties into creativity, and how the idea, the very idea of either giving up or destroying one's own master work destroys oneself. And what is so incredibly interesting about this moment is the fact that Aule, one of the Valar, warns the others, of course to no avail, that, hey, you really don't understand what you're asking. And of course we can understand why Aule would question this and would understand. He had the same occur with him with the creation of the dwarves. He repented of that act, but he also had the great gift of being forgiven and then his creation accepted. We still can question, though, how things might have been different. Because the interesting thing here is the messenger of Manwë comes as the Noldor are leaving Tir Antunya and essentially warns them to stay, wishes them to stay, but doesn't keep them there, doesn't tell them that they must stay. The Valar have not barred the Noldor from leaving Valinor. That is just not how it is. And yes, that may be the understanding of the Noldor, but that isn't the actual case. The problem, and what leads to their exile, and what leads to their doom, and what leads to their unnumbered tears, is the taking of blood, is murder. That, in and of itself, is the greatest sin of the Noldor, and as we will see in subsequent chapters, is the greatest cause of their strife to come. Those who took part, and those who didn't. Those who took part knowingly, and those who did by mistake. Those who took part and hid it, and those who reveal. But it also gets back to the naivete of the Valar, and what is perhaps their biggest mistake, and it's even stated as being so. And that perhaps much that is wrong with the world and much of the sorrow of the world might have avoided if they had chosen another way. We are led to believe by the events that we've seen and will continue to see that the Valar should never have brought the Eldar to Valinor. And one of the things we discussed in great depth in the meeting this morning was the idea that the Noldor themselves are spoiled children, as we've discussed before, who have been given much but have not learned the wisdom of how to cope with that knowledge, with that skill, and with that talent. And the Valar, who are so naive, they don't understand that such wisdom needs to be taught and understood before such gifts should even be given in the first place. Well, if you begin to think about this, the Valar were never intended to take on this helicopter parenting role towards the elves. Therefore, why would they even have the skill set? It wasn't what they were made for. Therefore, the lack of understanding we see and the lack of skill we see on their behalf is in part because they are going against what they should be doing. And again, to link this back to the music, is this perhaps a parallel with the moments that we had described in the Ainulindale, where those standing near to Melkor, of their own volition, mistakenly begin to sing along? If you've ever been in a choir and had someone singing next to you who's singing either a different melody or different words, unless you are really good at tuning it out, there is an incredibly high likelihood that eventually you're going to be singing along. And perhaps that's what we're seeing here. The Valar aren't necessarily doing this out of malice. They aren't necessarily doing it because Ilúvatar has told them to. This is their own choice. But it is also a choice that was made for perhaps the wrong reasons. Out of either a fear of Melkor and what he might do, maybe even a distrust of the elves and what they might do in reaction to Melkor, and not believing them capable or able to learn of their own skill and in their own way. We don't really know, but we can begin to see and understand the naivete that is apparent in the Valar by the fact that they are going against the role which seems to have been ordained for them. And indeed, we have again a continuance of the same representation of the Noldor as spoiled children in the character of Fëanor. You ask a child, give me your ball, give me your toy. Their immediate response is going to be, no, you can't take this from me. You take this from me, you're a thief just like him. It's a tantrum, and can be understood as such. And we know already from what we've been told, and then also due to the grief over the loss of his father, that Fëanor is very highly strung, prone to overreaction, and full of a blazing fire of spirit. And therefore anything he does, which interesting could be linked to the ring of fire that Gandalf wears, and perhaps that's why it functions in this way, inflames the spirit of all the Noldor. Some stay behind, of course, and some only leave reluctantly, many of whom end up returning and repenting. But he inflames the spirit of the Noldor against the Valar. And it essentially boils down to a common theme. That power, the having of power, the gaining of power, does not equal wisdom or the knowledge of how it should be used. Essentially what we're left here, looking at the Valar and the Eldar and their relationship to each other, is again looking back to a biblical reference in Genesis of Cain and Abel. It's almost a case of, as Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Who's responsible? Should they be responsible? How should they interact with each other, if they even should in the first place? Also, too, what's interesting when we look at the words that Fëanor gives as he's considering yielding the Silmarils to the Valar, he says to unmake my own creation, to unmake the Silmarils, will break me, will cause me to be slain. And perhaps he's being overdramatic, but it also harkens back to Tolkien's understanding of story and creation. We saw this in the admonition of Gandalf. To unmake something in order to understand it is folly. We see this too in the famous tower metaphor of Beowulf the Monster and the Critics, in which an old man builds a tower and his home out of the remains of an ancient ruin. And when he dies, archaeologists and other people from the area come by, see the inscriptions, see the statues, and pull the tower down, such that they can look at its constituent parts. and do not even begin to understand that the purpose of the tower was to climb to the top and see the sea. Well, this is, in a sense, an understanding of creation, an understanding of the link between the created and the creator, that they are intrinsically tied one to the other, and that when you break it apart, when you start to pull it apart, it kills something. Something is lost. Something intrinsic to the story is lost. So too, when we look at this portion of the story and begin to try to question where the ideas came from, whether from Tolkien's life or whether from his beliefs, we need to be careful such that this remain applicability and not become destruction. It's okay to look at source material and to look at Tolkien's beliefs and his life. And perhaps Tolkien himself even had his own definitive sources and reasons for writing as he wrote. Yet he probably, when pressed, wouldn't tell us what those definitive ideas or sources were. Indeed, if we look at letters, we go in a merry circle about Tom Bombadil and essentially wind back right at the beginning where we have the response of Goldberry to Frodo of he is master. We are meant to embrace the applicability of the story and to allow the metaphors, the linkages, the apparent allegory we may find in our own lives or in Tolkien's, to all exist and be there for the furtherance of the story and for the furtherance of the eucatastrophe and recovery brought by the story, by the wealth of information which is allowed to become part of it by our own experience, rather than narrow it down to a pin-like focus on what may or may not be a singular cause. This is the same thing when we look at the character of Beowulf and Grendel's mother, because we are to look at the story, not pull it apart into symbols or meanings or things like that, but understand it as something that actually happened within the context of the story, as a feigned history, and begin to understand it and interpret it from that lens, from within the story. And again, we reached the same conclusion, which we discussed earlier in terms of artistic representation, that Tolkien often works through both precision and ambiguity to allow an interpretation within a certain framework, but allow a profusion of additional meanings, of additional symbolism, of additional links which can be drawn together to form an amazing tapestry of what is actually happening here and the lens by which we can begin to understand it. Now, one of the things, too, in this chapter, which can be extremely frustrating as a reader, is to understand the nature of the Valar, as well as the nature of Fëanor. Because as a reader reading this chapter, as Becky so pointedly said, they talk at each other instead of to each other. Neither side can understand, whether they are even capable of understanding or not, what the other is trying to say and where they are coming from. They have no frame of reference for what the other is thinking or where they're coming from. And therefore they believe that they are being perfectly reasonable. But of course they're not. And to us as readers, this can be maddening. So too with this chapter, we talked quite a bit about the character of Ungoliant, which is something we will return to in the next. And the fact that Tolkien, who often is criticized as having too few women in his tales, actually, if anything, perhaps the only criticism you could give Tolkien is the fact that he has too few weak women. Because all of his women are so incredibly far and above in terms of influence, in terms of power, in terms of stature to everyone else, and that in reality their scarcity only makes them shine the brighter in terms of number. And yet we have many. We have Ungoliant, the female Valar, Varda, Yavanna, namely, being two of the more important, Yenna, Luthien, and then in The Lord of the Rings, Éowyn, Arwen, Galadriel, even characters as small as Rosie Cotton, all of which contain a power which far surpasses that we see of men. And the male characters we receive are highly, highly marred and broken characters who much of their story focuses on their need to surpass their limitations, to learn to live with their limitations, or to find redemption. Well, we jokingly said that the women are already there. They've done it. And they're the exemplar that the men in Tolkien's writing are trying to reach. And perhaps that puts them too much on a pedestal. But they are there, and they're some of the most fascinating characters Tolkien gave us. In particular, looking now at the character of Ungoliant, who is very dark, very powerful, and interestingly enough, much more terrifying than Melkor has ever been or ever will be. And we question to some degree why this might be. And part of it is that there's something alluring about Ungoliant. Something that kind of draws you to her, and yet you're horrified by the destruction she can leave in her wake. And also by the otherworldly character of her form as a monstrous spider, which again can be both horrifying and alluring. One of the interesting things to come out of Coriolis's film project is the idea of Ungoliant in her original form as a voluptuous and very sensual woman who is able to lure others to her. And in their cast of the Silmarillion, to lure Nessa to her, and by being scorned by her, eventually transform herself into a spider. This is an intriguing way to look at Ungoliant because she does indeed have that character, being someone who is absolutely fascinating in terms of her power and abilities, and also someone who perhaps, through a glamour of sorts, could entrap. It's similar to what we see with Sauron, and even with Melkor, when he is among the Noldor, where they're able to put a beautiful face on, if you will, and become the tempter or the temptress. Someone who speaks with a silver tongue, and from a place of beauty, and yet bends others to their will and towards corruption. She's a very intriguing character, and we'll talk about her more in our next session next week, in which we will continue our discussion of the flight of the Noldor, continuing probably from that point where she and Melkor have crossed into the northern portion of Middle-earth in their discussion there, and then on to the latter half of the chapter with the flight of the Noldor. Until next time.